what we are going to look at today is rigging up the character using the bone rigging tool. So we're going to be adding in some bones into it. So we've talked about rigging characters when we start creating parent-child relationships between our layers, such as the lower leg is connected to the upper leg, which is connected to the hips, connected to the torso, etc. But there's an actual bona fide rigging tool that is used when we are trying to rig together specific layers in our drawing, and it works well especially if we have noodle limbs on our characters, or spaghetti limbs, or whatever term you want to call it. So to make things a little bit easier, I am going to take a look at just a single arm on my character. So I have the single arm happening on my character, and that is my front arm. If I grab the rigging tool, before I start doing anything, one of the things I want to make sure I do is to turn off animation. While we're setting up the rig and getting our character ready to go, we want to make sure that animation is turned off, get everything configured, because then when we start making adjustments and tweaking things, we will be adding in keyframes, and the animation tool will be helping us do that automatically. So it's a good practice, just turn that off in the beginning. So now I have my arm here, and what I'm going to do is add in a series of control points into this object. As I add in these control points, these become my way to access this object. Now this is an arm, so we have an anchor point which would be around the shoulder area, and then I'm going to click to add in a point for the elbow, and then when I add in my next point, it's going to be for the end of the arm where the wrist attaches. Now that I have done that, I can see that I am going to just tweak my color a little bit, because the color is making it very difficult to see the rig that it's adding into my drawing. So I'm going to modify the color temporarily or permanently, it doesn't really matter. Now that makes it a little bit easier to see what's going on. So I've changed the color. So as we add in these bones, a couple points to recognize here. The first point here, this anchor point, this is what's going to control the movement of this whole shape. This next point is the elbow. The circle represents the sphere of influence. So the sphere of influence, while I am using the rigging tool, I can make it bigger or smaller, and that affects how sharp or how rounded the bend becomes when I use this for animation. Because when I bend this arm at the elbow, do I want it to have a crease or do I want it to be a big curve? The shape of this circle of influence affects that considerably. Another point to remember is that this shape can be keyframed, so it can be big on one frame and small on another. So it's not fixed once we do create it. So that's something good to file away in the back of your brain. If I look at the rig here, the selected points and bones show up in white. The other parts of it are showing up in not white. Whoop, I don't want to connect off of the second one from that elbow over there. So while we are working with the rigging tool, it's generally red. If I want to start animating this particular shape and grab the animation tool, it becomes green. And again, my color choice is just horrible for what we're doing today. Let's try something there. Okay, that's going to show a little bit better. So when I have the rigging tool, it's red. When I have the transform tool selected, it shows up in green. Green means it's getting ready to animate. If I look down in my timeline, I will see that now my layer has two additional layers added to it. These are reflecting the two bones that I did create. So I have bone 1 and bone 2, and here is my artwork layer. So it's similar to adding in a control peg to a layer. So when we've added pegs to layers, which we'll be adding some pegs to this little animated group that we're working with here anyway, bones are like pegs, except that they're going to be much more useful while we are animating. So before we start rigging up more things and getting more complex into it, what I want to do is to look at how this animates and affects the animation. Like every other thing as we work on it, we collapse it down to the topmost control peg. We're now at frame 1. At that point, I can hit F6, insert a starting keyframe. Then I'm going to just extend the exposure for this particular layer using F5 on the keyboard, so that extends it out. Now if I go back to the first frame here and I have the animation or the transform tool selected, animate is turned on, I can now move out in my timeline and start animating. I could hit F6, that adds in the next piece of the animation, and now if I bend, we will see how we get a nice smooth rounded bend occurring with our, and if I scrub back the timeline, we will see it moves. If I continue further out in time, if I don't hit F6 and stretch, you will notice that I can, unlike doing cutout animation, I'm not limited to the original length of what my object was before. I can make it longer or shorter as I go. But I also can change that sphere of influence. So if you notice as I change that sphere of influence, it is indeed changing the bend so I don't get that crease. If the sphere is small, we get a sharp angle occurring in the arm. If I make that circle bigger, I get a rounded shape happening within the animation. If I continue further out in time, I can bring it back. So we can see how we're able to bend, transform, move it. If I want to rotate the entire arm, then I go up to the top control point. And we can see how that top control point moves. And you will notice there should be an interesting thing happening, which is I am now starting my rotation from the last keyframe that I hit using F6. When I did my control point adjustments and a little bit of bending, that was only keyframing the elbow joint. So now the shoulder is keyframing from frame 10 all the way to frame 25. So this is why in the past, when I've encouraged you, every time you get to a new keyframe, you hit F6, so it adds keyframes to every single layer. The reason that we do that is, again, notice we bend. Now we see the animation of the arm bending, but it's not rotating yet. This is the last keyframe at frame 10 for the top, or the very center registration point for this object. Now, if I go out to frame 25 and rotate this keyframe, this bone, we will see that the rotation starts all the way at frame 10 because that is the first time it put in a keyframe for that particular bone. So if we look at that top bone, we will see where its keyframe is. And we can compare that to where the keyframe is for the lower limb, which is bending on those two keyframes. And this is also where we see these keyframes are showing up as black squares. If I collapse this, we'll see the white squares are indicating that all the layers don't share this particular keyframe. So if you've wondered why when you start animating, sometimes you get a white square and sometimes you get a black square, the black square indicates there's a keyframe on every layer that is underneath this. The white square indicates that there's a keyframe on some of the layers, but not all of the layers. So once we have proven that we can move a limb and understand, remember that we use the rigging tool when we are adjusting the rig, and we use the transform tool when we are animating it. We do not use the advanced animation tools for doing this type of animation. We want to use the transform tool, and that's going to work better for us as we try and set that up. So that's step one that we are going to care about. Also notice as I've extended this, the keyframes are on the bones because the bones are effectively creating areas of influence and modifying the artwork beneath where they are. So if I have the artwork, say, out here and grab the paintbrush and then try to paint with what's going on, well, notice that we get some really weird stuff happening. We're getting some bizarre offsets occurring within the artwork, and like, well, that's awkward now.
Sure that
So my artwork jumped over here even though I painted with the brush in this location. So that's really odd and awkward to look at. If I notice I'm still in the camera view, that's showing me how things look. If I go back to frame 1, we can see that where I drew this in relation to my artwork and see, okay, there is my shoulder point, there's my wrist, and now I have this point over here. Now if I follow what's going on, when it rotates, you can actually see how it's behaving in a very predictable manner now. So if we do our artwork on the initial starting pose, the resting, it's called the resting frame, resting pose, then it will line up. The other option is to work in the drawing view. And in the drawing view, it now shows me the artwork without my rig or anything else attached into it. So let me first get rid of this junk over here. So in this view, if I were to then add in additional elements, what this is going to reveal is certain types of artwork do not work well for doing our noodle arm kinds of animation. So we're on frame 1, and we can see what's happening to the artwork as I've modified that sphere of influence to try to round out my animation. It's effectively sliding the pixels around, giving my arm a very unusual look. If I slide this back, whoop, wrong tool, not the paintbrush, go back and grab the transform, we can see how we can get it returning. Now if it happened fast enough, no, we still couldn't get away with it. But it helps us to see what that difference is and how that area of influence is working. If you have more complex artwork, this is probably not going to be the ideal way to animate, and you will want to then instead use cutout style animation so that you can maintain your highly detailed complex outlines. But you can combine this where you have a layer of bones combined with layers of non-bones that are filling the gaps that allow you for some bending and rounding and curving automatically that just don't have all the same detail. There's a lot of ways we can solve our problem of how do we put this together and how do we animate it. It's not a bad idea. Once I collapse this layer, it just says bone, but this really is going to be my arm front bone. So if I name it that way, then when I look at my layers, it's going to make more sense because I'm going to be adding in to my back arm, I'm going to be adding in a rig as well. So now I'm going to continue the process and go into my back arm, grab the rigging tool, click for the shoulder, click for the elbow, click for the wrist, and then with the rigging tool selected, I'm just going to go to what I think will be about my default size for my shape and attach that there. So we're getting much closer to having our parts set up and configured for this particular animation. Now that I have my two arm layers with their bone rigs ready to go, I'm going to rename my arm back. So that I can see that. Now I'm not collapsing those just yet because we're going to have to do a little bit more work. So what I want to do is I want to attach the hand so that the hand is going to be attached to each arm. And in order to attach the hand to the arm and make it a child of it, when we want to attach it to the end of a group of bones, what we have to do is we have to add something else in that we haven't used before. So we have to create a kinematic output. Now that is our technical term, and it sounds scarier than it is. But if I go to the hand front layer with the hand front layer selected, in my layer options where I can add in new layers, we will see there's an option for kinematic output. and I select Kinematic Output. When I do that, it adds in a Kinematic Output layer for that. It's not a bad idea before we do that, which I forgot to do, is to set the pivot point for the artwork for the hand. And then we go to the kinematic layer, and we're going to be attaching this then to the arm bone here so that it becomes part of that structure. So we can look at how all of this works by parenting this kinematic output. And again, as we're naming layers, it's not a bad idea to name this one, but because it's mostly buried inside of the arm front grouping of layers, it's not going to be end of the world if we just leave it. So if I drag this up so it becomes a child of the arm front, and now move the arm, we can, well, let's extend it out too. So I extend out the hand. We can see that the hand right now is behaving as a child. See how it's behaving as a child of the upper arm bone. When the upper arm bone moves, it moves with it. So that tells us this kinematic output, we want to then instead be a child of the lower arm bone. So I can now take that kinematic child output and I can drag it to the lower arm bone. And as I do that, now we can see how it stays attached to the arm. The next question becomes, do I want the hand on top of, or do I want the hand underneath the end of the arm? Because as you can see, it changed. If I turn back on my other hand, we can see where one hand is in front of the arm, one hand is behind the arm, and those aren't extending out. We'll just F5 everything out. So we can see one is in front, one is behind. It's not more or less correct, it's just which do you want it to be. Doesn't really matter. I can leave it as is for now. But if we look at the layer structure, I'll see that I have the arm front, the upper arm bone, the kinematic output with the hand, and then the arm front artwork. So now we have bone 1, bone 2, and the hand gets its output. Advantage of doing this is once we have set this up, now this hand, at any point in time, I can now, if I take this arm layer, make sure I've F6'd, but if I go out a couple frames, I can now grab this hand with the transform tool, and I can now animate it. And I don't have to be on the arm keyframes. It's now moving independently. And we can animate to our heart's content. As you can see, I have a relatively broken wrist because the movements it's making would break a normal non-noodle arm, but it's a noodle arm, so it's okay that we have it moving this way. And as it moves up to its final place, I'm going to let the hand move past, go a couple frames, and then bring the hand back to its starting position. So we're able to attach the artwork layer to a bone rigging layer through the use of the kinematic output. If I want to repeat that on the other arm, I go to the back hand, click, and before I do this, I'm going to just set the pivot point for the back hand so it's done. Usually we set it right about where the wrist is. It's not a bad idea if it's sitting about at the same point as the end of the last bone on the arm, because then it will be looking connected to that point of animation. Then in layers, add in kinematic output, And now this kinematic output, I am going to add it to the back arm bone. Now I'm just going to pull it down and then decide on this one I want the arm in front, the hand behind. So now that I have done that, my project is getting much cleaner. I can hit F6 for my starting keyframe, and I can start animating. And we see how the hand stays attached to the body, or to the arm as it moves. The next thing I need to do is to attach these two arms to the body, attach the head to the body, put in a master peg, and we're going to be rocking and rolling. My arms, I've got some movement and rigging done. They're configured and ready to go. Now I'm going to go back into my body and my head layers here. First thing I want to do is to establish the pivot points for those respective entities. The body is relatively close to the center of where I want it to be. Now this particular body, when I look at it, because it has this almost ghost-like shape to it, it could potentially have a rigging attached into it, so then I could move and distort the body shape and animate that if I was so motivated, but I'm not going to do that at the moment. Now the head, I typically will always try and position where I imagine that the head is emerging from the base of the neck, so that once the head is there, if the head animates, it makes, without a visible neck, it looks like the head is moving on its neck shape. So that's usually what I try and do with those types of pivot points. So I get the pivot points set up for those layers. So now we can look, we have the head, we have the body. So if I move the body, I want the head to stay attached to it. If I move, and I also want the arms to stay attached to the body, so I need to build up the relationship between those. Because the body is a single layer, I could get away with, in this instance, of creating a master peg that would have control of everything, but I could also say that the head is now a child of the body. And if I do that, then we have to figure out how we can do some basic nudging and remember how to do that process. So if I've pulled the head down so that the head is now a child of the body, we see we lost part of his face and it looks really awkward and weird. But what we're able to do is, if we select the transform tool and the head layer is currently active and my active window indicated by the red frame showing on it, because in my preferences I have selected under general focus on mouse enter. So I focus on mouse enter. So I click on the head layer, go up here with the transform tool active, hold down the Option or Alt key, and now I'm going to adjust the positioning of this head in Z space by hitting the down arrow, and that now pulls it forward. So now we have the head in front of the body, even though if I look at the layers, the head is behind the body. Completed. Now what I'm going to do is attach the arm rigs to the body as well, so I can just drag those up onto the body. They're part of it. And I can decide whether I want the head to be in front or behind them. But one thing to notice, as the arm goes up here, we can see how the head is in front of the arm. So my front arm, as it swings, is going behind the body. So as I do this, I may want to, when the arm is crossing the body, start thinking about, do I want to nudge the arm in front of the body? If I want to nudge the arm in front of the body, if I turn on animate, I can even decide at which point I want it to happen, and that's a keyframeable option. So I can go to my front arm right here and hit F6 to insert a keyframe, and now with the arm selected, go into my main window. Now I can hold down Option and work on trying to nudge my rig. Trying to do this, I have to make sure I'm checking the arm and the hand. I can't nudge both of them together. So I can now pull the arm so it's now in front. We can see though it's behind the hand is behind the head. His arm is in front. I'm going to bend the arm a little bit more. We can see how that's problematic. So if I'm going to do this, I mean, he is kind of a ghost. Oh, he put his arm through his head. I'm going to just adjust this. I want a little more roundness in the elbow. But the arm is in the head, so that's a problem. So that tells me what I might want to do. Let's go back to the point where it just hits the head right here. And at this point, I want to grab the hand. Click on the hand art layer, mouse enter into the main drawing, and now we can nudge so the hand goes in front. And now let's try again. So part of it is because I had existing keyframes, and this is a animatable property. The existing keyframes that I had from before, I now need to update those as well with that nudge position. So now we can see how the arm is able to move in relation to the head. Once we have all of these layers, they're all attached onto the body. It's not a bad idea to add one final peg. This is going to not be my body peg. This will be my master peg. And this master peg you can establish using the Advanced Animation Rotate tool where you want it to be. It's pretty common that we add it typically somewhere down near around where the feet are. So now we can, if we had feet, so now we can see how the whole thing can move as part of that. But now that I have that point established for my master peg, I can now just hit F6 on frame 1 and we're ready to complete my animation, moving all of my layers and parts together. And as we see, we now have quite a bit of activity happening in our project, and it's going a little bit on the fast side, just to slow it down to make it easier to see. Lower the frame rate. And it was more fun at the high speed, so we'll just leave it there.